The title of the talk is from a performance on the occasion of the 1575 wedding of Francesco I and his second wife Bianca Capello. The main event of the wedding program was a theatrical production of I Tre Cavalieri Persiani, in which Francesco appeared as one of the Persian knights. In recent years, a few exhibition catalogs and other publications that concern the relationship between Persia and Italy in the early modern period have appeared. While these publications focus on Rome and Venice, I will show that from the 15th to the 17th centuries, Persia comes to play a significant role in the dynastic self-fashioning of the Medicis and in the trade policy of Grand Ducal Tuscany. Two narratives are interwoven here. The first concerns a genealogy of cultural images. The Persians, as they're appropriated by the Medicis, are first cast as Magi and then as powerful warriors and armored kings. I will describe transmutations in the image of the Persian from the Magi during the time of the Cosimo Vecchio to the Knights of Francesco I, and finally to the compelling and puzzling image of Caravaggio's Shield of Medusa, which Ferdinand placed in the hand of an armored statue of Shah Abbas, which is held in the Armory Gallery of the Uffizi throughout the 17th century. I will address the import of this evolution for the rhetorical and covert strategies of the Medicis, describing the ways in which Persia emerges as a useful locus of identification for the Medicis as they transform themselves from merchants to mercantilist yet virtuous royals. We close the door. Okay. The second tale addresses political, economic, and historiographical matters. Why was an Armenian secret agent sent to Florence by the Persian Shah Abbas as a substitute for the official and public, not to mention notorious emissary, Robert Shirley? The existence of the secret envoy, I might add, is virtually unknown to historians, as it comes to light after I suspected the existence of such a figure and sought him out, locating him in the archives. I will come back to the Persian Knights of Francesco's wedding, but my point of departure is the provocative misnaming of two Filippo Napolitano's paintings commissioned by Francesco's nephew Cosimo II in 1620. I located these large panels in the deposits of the Uffizi Gallery when working on globalizing the humanities curriculum at NYU in Florence. Upon the restoration in 2004, the paintings were introduced to the public at an Ottoman fascination exhibit in Istanbul as a Cacciatori Orientali. The exhibit catalog notes that the 1979 Uffizi inventory refers to the paintings as I Cacciatori Persiani, though there is no reason other than a small inscription on an elephant for this designation. Research into the original naming of the paintings proves illuminating. The 1890 inventory, which is the earliest Uffizi one, does not offer a title at all, but a description that brings attention to the fact that the panels describe two different events, one a return from a hunt and the other a royal cavalcade. Yet the original 1620 inventory of the Guardaroba of Cosimo II, held in the State Archives of Florence, does refer to the two panels as Caccia al Persiano, the Persian hunt. The designation of the paintings as Persian hunt points to two significant matters. The collection and depiction of exotic animals in artwork was a means of self-fashioning, as the Medicis claim royalty, a practice studied by Angela Groom. Yet Persian hunt points up a significance that goes beyond parameters of animal collection and depiction. A Persian hunt is an activity by which symbolically the first mythical Persian kings established civility on earth by subduing nature, a theme which appears within various textual and graphic sources in Florence beginning in the 15th century. The question of the Persianness of the Napolitano's hunt scene, two minor works, as well as the logic of the 2004 misnamings in Istanbul, highlight a geopolitical framework within which any Western understanding of the Orient in the aftermath of the 1453 can be grasped. For this is a geopolitical dynamic which occasioned the Western humanist historiographical revision of Asia, whereby Persia emerges as the good, noble, civilized ally, Asian ally over and against the barbarian and ignoble Turks. Yet establishing the Persianness of the Napolitano's title has led me to conclude that the Medici's relation to Persia went even beyond this general framework. Persian ally in a battle with the Turk. I've come to find evidence of a privileged relation to Persia, symbolic, material, geopolitical, and mercantile, at its heights during the Ferdinand's time, which will be the focus of today's talk. In her influential study of Western image of Islamic empires during the late Renaissance, during the Renaissance, Margaret Meserve has shown that in the aftermath of the fall of Constantinople to the Ottoman Turks, Renaissance humanists began to romanticize the histories of other Islamic and Asiatic dynasties, specifically that of Persia, while they demonized the Turks. In this realignment, the humanists were inspired by a Xenophon whose Cyropedia presented Cyrus, the founder of Persian Empire, as a paragon of royal wisdom, virtue, piety, and political savvy. Francesco Filelfo's introductory note to the translation of Cyropedia in 1470, following Poggio Branciolini's 1450 translation, makes the claim that all monarchies, but especially ancient monarchies, are virtuous. Filelfo's histories and Branciolini's vicissitudes of fortune were pivotal in converting Persia into a noble empire. And Timur, who had defeated and captured Bayezid the Turk, into a noble Parthian Persian prince. Thus, Uzun Hasan, a 15th century descendant of Timur, emerges as the good and virtuous Persian king to whom Rome and Venice would send independent ambassadors in an attempt to woo the king into an intercontinental alliance that would strike at the Ottoman Empire simultaneously from east and west. As contemporary Persia emerges as a military ally against the Turks, the study of biblical and not only classical texts brings deeper awareness of the significance of the age of Cyrus and Darius for the development of the European philosophy. Ancient Persia comes to serve not only as a model of education of Renaissance princes, but emerges as a font of mystery, alien wisdom, home to the Magi, sibyls, and astrologers. This latter is really a summary of John Rowe in the Renaissance image of Zoroaster or Zarathustra. It's a great book. It is in this context of this historical realignment that the Medici, beginning with Cosimo Vecchio, become the patrons of the Confraternity of the Magi in Florence, a position that, as Richard Trexler and Rap Hatfield have shown, was instrumental in legitimizing the Medici as the de facto rulers of Florence. Trexler holds that the essence of the Magi story is a political drama. Three Magi arrive from the exotic East in order to recognize and legitimize a Western king, Jesus. Jesus needed the Magi's magic and recognition in order to be revealed. Through a reading of the early Christian evidence, he shows that they had, because they had astrological skills, and they're called the Magi, as Zoroastrian priests in ancient Persia were called, many assumed that the Magi were from Persia. and significantly came by the order of the King of Kings as a delegation. It was easy to imagine that the subjects of that great king recognized Jesus' royalty long before Constantine did. This is a political reading of the Magi story that legitimizes monarchy and speaks to the wisdom and nobility of the Persians or Persia. In Gozzoli's Journey of the Magi in the Medici Chapel, as well as the yearly reenactments of this story in Florence during outdoor cavalcades, the Medicis cast themselves as Magi or kings and would associate themselves with magic and monarchy. During the last third of the 16th century, the Magi's importance as a vehicle for the description of princely power and sacrality diminished publicly, Trexler shows and argues, and as a new type of private princely festivity with a similar grammar appears on the stage. The elaborate theatrical performances for the wedding of Grand Duke Francesco I with the Venetian Bianca Capello in 1579 can be understood in terms of this transformation. Francesco commissioned Raffaele Gualterotti to produce a program which took place over several days, during which an entourage of Venetian ambassadors and guests were richly hosted and entertained. The central component of the program was a theatrical mock joust called Tre Cavalieri Persiani, in which Francesco and two Medicis played the part of Persian knights who, having heard the marriage of Francesco to Bianca, had arrived to Florence to pay their homage, and also as returning champions to defend the title of Persian women as the most virtuous in the world. The entry of the three Persian knights upon a miraculously magnificent throne escorted into the lavishly decorated courtyard of Palazzo Pitti is here described, and I'm going to read a description of Gualterotti's in English here. The bright and grandiose theater was filled with an astounding silence because the eager audience had already been quietly signaled that the merry games evoking temerarious wars were about to begin. From underneath a curtain that shielded the entrance to a cave, two men emerged, dressed in Persian fashion, along with two little Ethiopians. Their outfits were magnificent and sumptuous. Two remarkably huge elephants led by two Persians and restrained and spurred on by two little Ethiopians who were sitting over the elephants' large heads. Suddenly, like thunder and lightning, a powerful noise of drums, trumpets, and 1,000 more barbarian instruments and cannons were heard as the entrance to the cave opened up. In the sea, one would see many beautiful things, but one of them was especially beautiful, the wonderful city of Venice, so feared by the rest of the world and so dear to God. When this beautiful and proud parade was over, there appeared, pulled by the above-mentioned elephants, not so much a carriage as an enormous throne made with Persian pomp by a Tuscan mind. The three Persian defenders sat on luxurious regal seats. This enormous carriage rolled on four wheels, the rear ones depicting the sun and the moon, which symbolized the passing of time, and the front ones almost like a starry sky, thanks to the many lights that hung from them without moving, in spite of the movement of the wheels. I don't know how that would work. But terrestrial and divine majesty appear in the figure of three Persian foreigners who arrive in a manner recalling the journey of the Magi, having heard and are led by fixed stars to Palazzo Pitti to pay homage and tribute. After the appearance of the Persian Medici, knights from other nations, Europe, Ethiopia, and Africa follow. Lastly, a Venetian knight emerges from the sea, signaling the victory of Venetians over the Turks. Bianca, as the Venetian bride, and the very presence of Venice recalls to mind the 3 decades of war between Venice and the Turks, still ongoing, as well as the noble Persian defenders of virtue whom Francesco emulates. The reference to the Turks as nemesis of Venetians does grant political significance to the theatrical casting of Francesco as the Persian knight, yet references to geopolitics are minimal here. One encounters more astrology than geopolitics. It's well known that Francesco, just as Gualterotti, possessed a greater taste for alchemy and the occult than for real geopolitical affairs. His foundry distilled plants for medicinal uses, but also conducted alchemical activities and carried out divinations. In his secret room, referred to as the studiolo, one finds a collection of images referring to the rare objects stored in Cabinet of Curiosities. Prometheus, the original alchemist, is the focal point of the ceiling. There are at least 2 historical Persian kings also portrayed in the ceiling, Darius and Cambyses, and I apologize for the bad quality of these pictures. Darius and Cambyses, whose mythical and royal genealogies trace to Qumars, the first mythical Persian king and the giver of civilization, arts, and fire. And what we have here on the right is actually Sohbat al-Akhbar, which is the mythical genealogy of the kings of Persian kings, and what you have on the right side here is Qumars, and this was in the Laurentian Library in the Medici book collection. So there was absolutely quite an interest in the mythical genealogies of kings of Persian kings, which I will refer to. Francesco's Persia was that of his studiolo, land of ancient and mythical kings, and not the actual political, military, and commercial ally. He had done nothing to build upon Cosimo I's Livornino laws, which were meant to expand Tuscany's interest in the East. Francesco's brother Ferdinand became the Grand Duke in 1589 after 2 decades of serving as a cardinal in Rome, where he gained considerable knowledge of the Persia of his day, and he had commissioned the Pope's envoy Gianbattista Vecchietti to purchase Persian manuscripts for the Stamperia Orientale di Medici. Giambattista, known as Vecchietti the Persian, remained Ferdinand's Persia advisor throughout his reign, while he developed a strategic, commercial, diplomatic relations with that country. In fact, one of the first initiatives of Ferdinand as Grand Duke, I have found, was a serious and bold military alliance with Persia, or an attempt, at least. In a 1589 letter to the secretary of Philip II, King of Spain, Vecchietti asks whether the king would object if Ferdinand sent a strategic artillery and fortification specialist to Persia. Developing relationships with Persia, I argue here, form part of a comprehensive strategy to develop Livorno as a free port. In 1591, Ferdinand renewed Cosimo I's Livornino laws, inviting merchants of all nations in the city under construction, Jews, Spanish, Portuguese, Greeks, Turks, Moors, Armenians, and Persians were named. The descriptions of a Persian envoy in 1599 gives a sense of Ferdinand's plans for addressing Persia. When we had been in Florence a fortnight, well entertained and seeing all the sights, the Duke sent for us to come to see him in Pisa, where he was residing with the Grand Duchess. There he kept us 10 days with princely entertainment, showing us the rich and curious treasures that are the property of the Duke. Afterwards, they took us to Livorno to see a new city that was being built there, and which will be a very magnificent place. There is also a fortress in the building and a safe entrance to be made to the harbor, which will become one of the finest ports in the Mediterranean Sea. To do this work, they have here more than 5,000 slaves at work. The Tuscan port city played a fundamental role not only in the economic policies of Ferdinand, but also of Shah Abbas himself. Over the period, during which Ferdinand was granting licenses to Armenian merchants in Livorno. Note that in 1593, over half of the trading houses in Livorno belonged to Armenians, over half. Shah Abbas was developing a parallel trade policy that granted the same minority a monopoly over the Iranian silk trade. Ina Maccabi and Rudi Mati in independent studies have shown that this policy of Shah Abbas takes shape within the context of the waning Portuguese supremacy in the Persian Gulf, as the English and the Dutch East India companies began to arise as formidable powers. A consensus among the historians of Safavi Iran is emerging that despite the diplomatic gestures to Western companies and powers, Shah Abbas was not about to offer Persian silk trade to either of these parties. He preferred the group under his control, and the Armenians he settled in the new Jolfa in Esfahan suited him. They had experienced trading in silk. Ah, that's nice. And enjoyed family networks throughout European ports, including in Livorno. Given the diplomatic disaster, it is actually quite surprising that Shah Abbas again sends the Shirley brother on a European mission only 9 years later, at a time when he knew that the prospect of real alliance between Europe and Persia against the Turks was unrealistic. The reason for this famous dispatch have not been explained. Angelo Piedmontese has studied this mission in depth, but yet he does not indicate the motivation behind sending another Shirley. This 1609 mission was publicized widely and reproduced in images, a few of which I will show here. Despite having to deal with the sordid legacy of his brother, Robert by and large manages to control the situation and emerges as the public ambassador of Shah Abbas throughout Europe over the course of the next 2 decades, and eventually settles in Rome with his Circassian wife. I'll show you a few pictures. This is from the Quirinale, and okay. Robert Shirley's identity as an Englishman representing the Shah was provocative. He wore and was depicted as wearing the cross on his Persian turban. The Flemish painter Anthony van Dyck, this is on the right side the image, is studying Robert's Persian costume as he walks about Rome. That's that one. And this is as ambassadors. They're just coming up with a hybrid costume of his own, but it's supposed to be a Persian costume that he is wearing. And these are as ambassadors to Rome. This is, of course, a very shiny picture, and it contains the official story. The very image of an Englishman brought up in Shah Abbas's court, the brother of a fugitive convict, international agent, a converted Catholic, wearing a turban with a cross, representing Shah Abbas the Great, did not encourage confidence. The burgeoning East India companies, both Dutch and English, as well as the Spanish crown, viewed the Shirleys as renegade actors and a threat in the crucial years before the trade treaties were established with Persia. Robert was a dubious figure for Shah Abbas himself, and there is evidence, or I'm arguing, I found evidence, that he was not sent in good faith, at least to Tuscany. In a 1609 letter from Shah Abbas to Ferdinand, which is also not published in any of the catalogs, either Pontecorvo or Piedmontese, but it's in the State Archives of Florence, we gain an important clue concerning the circumstances of Robert's first dispatch to Europe. In the epistle, Shah Abbas apologizes for the tardy response to Ferdinand, and he explains it away by noting that the Christian messengers sent by the Grand Duke had wanted to convert to Islam, but the Shah had not permitted him to do so out of respect for the Grand Duke. He, the messenger, had escaped and disappeared. Whether this is true story or not, the significance lies in the fact that the Shah was trying to save face on the question of conversion, and was admonishing the Christian rulers for allowing the first embassy, led by Antony, with the Persian subjects to convert. In the next line, Shah Abbas says that he is sending instead Robert Shirley, with the letter, with the response. Shirley is to be trusted, having been given both written and oral instructions. Thus, then, we learn about the particulars about the Robert's mission to Tuscany. Yet, given that the Shirley was a suspect and compromised figure, given that Shah Abbas leveraged his power with the East India companies by granting the silk trade to Armenians, given the importance of Armenian trade for the Ferdinand, and the politics of conversion, I suspected the existence of alternate Armenian envoy sent by Shah Abbas. A search in the Medici archives not only located the Armenian agent, but also the evidence of an extensive mediation between Persia and the Grand Duchy by an Armenian network. In a January 1609 letter from Belisario Vinto, which is a Secretary of State of Ferdinand, to Gian Battista Vicchetti, it's a letter, it says, reports that an Armenian has arrived here. He declares that he is Christian and he goes to Mass, and he has brought the enclosed letter in enclosed cloth pouch so that it's neither has the wax nor the gold cover that the other one brought by Count Don Roberto Shirley. He declares that this letter is from the King of Persia, other elements to imply that besides dealing with goods and Armenian matters, he declares he is ambassador to the aforementioned King of Persia, and that through interpreters he has already talked to somebody about the Aleppo expedition venture. He affirms he is the son of a general administrator of the king or another favorite minister of his, but to speak frankly, the more he says he is more of an ambassador than the others have been in the past, the more he makes us suspicious, and we would not like for this to become a cave of alchemist ambassadors. Ferdinand does grant safe passage to this Armenian with the name of Kuge Sefer, who identifies himself as the real ambassador and Shirley as the cover, and while at the same time Robert Shirley makes his way through Europe, first to Spain and then secretly through Amsterdam and then to England. Yet this was not the first Armenian who had arrived from Persia to the court of Ferdinand. A few months earlier, in June 1608, another Armenian case is brought to Ferdinand's attention. And this is from the Venetian ambassador to Florence, writing back to Florence. The enclosed memoir was brought to my house by the patriarch of the Armenians. He tells me that he traveled several times into Florence, that he dealt with His Highness Ferdinand de' Medici, and that he is his most devoted servant, and as such he intends to take on this task and to show that truly this Giovanni mentioned in the memoir is a retainer of the King of Persia, Shah Abbas the Great, and has served him for many years, living continuously along with his wife and children in the king's own palace, Ali Qapu. Being a clever man, he was sent by the king to Constantinople disguised as a merchant in order to spy diligently on the affairs of the port. It seems to me it would be a good idea for the patriarch to intercede so that this man may be given at least an allowance to help him return to his country. If granted this contribution, he would give the king a positive account which he thinks would be pleasing to the Grand Duke given the friendship and reciprocal understanding between them. This missive, in addition to the earlier ones, give a sense of the interconnection of the military, commercial, diplomatic interest in Persia during the reign of Ferdinand, and specifically points up to the mediating role of the Armenians in the military plans, the reference to Aleppo, which I will say a little more about, to create an alternative trade route through Aleppo. In the same year, the Armenian secret messenger is given safe passage. Ferdinand receives a shield of Medusa commissioned from Caravaggio as a gift from the Roman Cardinal del Monte. This is an iconic object. Less known is the use to which Ferdinand puts the shield. He places it in a Wunderkammer, where within the hand of an armored Oriental knight and seated atop an armored wooden horse. The figure was situated in front of another Oriental armored character. Finally, the two horsemen in the corner of the hall, facing each other, were encircled by further armored personages. Ulrich Middeldorf has studied the 17th century descriptions of the two armors in detail and has concluded with great certainty that the two armors were gifted to Ferdinand from Shah Abbas. One of them, he is certain that is a stand-in for the Persian king. This is from the 1630 inventory of the shield in the Uffizi Gallery, which was the original inventory of the shield. And this is how the horseman is described. A figure on the said horse with the scale armor all wrought in a shiny gold and gray peacock eye pattern, with the sleeves and collar made of iron, and as crest a turban of white cloth with a wooden point on top of the turban decorated with a gold peacock eye pattern, with hand covers, an arrow in one hand, and in the other a shield in which a Medusa is held, all covered with the snakes, what was painted by Caravaggio. The description of the turban with the pointed wooden taj, which is a Safavi kolah hat, among other details, identifies the armor as Persian and as the figure as representing a Persian warrior. This conclusion is confirmed by the descriptions of other travelers to Florence in the 17th century that is well documented by the author that I just mentioned. What is the allegorical, political, and rhetorical significance of this image? What does Ferdinand enact or dramatize in this image of Persian king in armor with the shield of Medusa? I will conclude with 2 points. An armored Shah Abbas, carrying the metaphor of military virtue, allows the Medici to identify with and assimilate a Muslim and Oriental monarch into the early modern Tuscan court. Ferdinand's arming of Shah Abbas with the Medusa, while indeed theatrical, it was also rhetorical. It was meant to persuade. We saw that the arming extended also into the theater of war. His first act as the Grand Duke, we recall, was to send Shah Abbas strategic artillery and military know-how. This is unprecedented. It's very, very rare that at this time any Western power actually sent strategic artillery. They said all the time they would. They never did, and Shah Abbas was complaining all the time that all there is talk, and never actually any serious intention of doing so. The general disposition which crystallizes in the plans for Aleppo expedition, which was to link up with Persians and creating another trading route bypassing the Ottoman territory for the Armenian trade, was passed on to Cosimo II. This explains the prolonged Near Eastern campaigns of Cosimo II, and also his hosting of the Druze Emir, where everybody talks about, but we never know what he was doing in this Druze Emir in Palazzo Pitti, which is otherwise seems pointless. My second point concerns the genealogy of images. Before we saw Persians cast as Magi, they would be assimilated as wise men with the biblical virtue of piety, and yet also allow the Medici to associate themselves with the Persian royalty. Now they are going to associate themselves with Persian monarchy under the metaphor of military armor and with the virtue of noble power. In both cases, the desire on the part of the Medici's association with the original monarchy, Persia emerges as a trope constantly adapted to the situation. Thank you very much. Yes.
There is a mystery that I've been trying to unlock for many years without success, but perhaps you can. Several years ago, I read in the publication of the Center of Dante Studies in Ravenna, there are more statues in in public places of Dante in Tehran than in any other city. And this
is it true? Is it actually true?
That's what they claim. And there was a picture of a later statue erected to Dante, and it was when the infamous Ahmadinejad was the mayor of Tehran. Now, this is very surprising considering the horrific depiction of Mohammed in Dante's Inferno, which Edward Said speaks of as one of the worst examples of Orientalism. Now, what do you think accounts for this? Of course, in Persia, they don't erect statues to military or political leaders, but there are many, many statues of poets all around. And poetry is very important. Dante has been translated many times in Persian. What accounts for, does this have anything to do with this? With this love for Dante in Persia?
At this moment, in the contemporary moment, and I don't know what Ahmadinejad loves, that's what I'm trying to say.
No,
the connection, well, I think there are studies, there are other people who actually do this work, the influences of actually Islamic texts on Dante's work, the other way around, right? I think there are people who are working on that. Dante's Divine Comedy was popular in Iran, right? I don't know why. I cannot explain why at this moment. I mean, I would be guessing, right? But there were actually television shows when I was growing up on dramatization of the Divine Comedy. It had many in Tehran, and there were different offshoots of this. Now, are there similarities between the mystical images in Islam, in the Sufism, and some images of paradise in Dante? People have talked about that, but I don't know whether I would be able to explain and why Dante is loved in Iran. I think Dante is a universal poet. That's what I think. I think that's what I would say. Any questions? Yes.
I'm really fascinated of all your presentation. In particular, I'm working on the 15th century, and it is interesting how some images, strong images, continue to be strong images of also another geographical and another time and space. And in particular, I would like to go back to this description.
Which one?
No, the last one.
Here.
This one.
Yes.
And the representation of this figura sopra al di là del vecchio cavallo armata, and
yes.
with the symbol of a Medusa,
yes.
and also Medusa, but also in l'altra mano uno scudo. Could be the representation of a palace?
Of a palace?
And it could be a particular meaning in the context in which it's...
In what sense? I'm not getting it.
The palace is usually represented with a lancia, and since from antiquity, and also in Florence was very popular with the Botticelli, the representation of Botticelli, palace of Botticelli. And so I was wondering if it could be...
Well, and that would be in the military armor, is it?
Exactly. It's the representation of the strength, and evocating the image of Minerva, in form of Minerva,
yes.
representing the disease of Quattrocento, with the scudo of Medusa and the lancia. Also
Very
sometimes
interesting.
the lancia is represented with the canna.
Yes.
So not with the warm, there is of course different variatio in the Quattrocento, but usually palace could be represented with these two signs. So I was wondering if there could be any in this context.
But it would be interesting to really think about what would be the hybrid. This is a hybrid figure,
Okay.
obviously. I think maybe you can respond to that, right? You want to respond to this?
No.
No, it's certainly a hybrid figure because the turban is a contemporary Safavi, very, very specific Safavi turban. That, in fact, it's not just any Oriental turban at all. The pointed collar, right there, it is what the Safavis use, and this is why it absolutely, without any doubt, identifies it as a Shah Abbas standing both gift, and then there are also many other descriptions of the more descriptions that I didn't put. There was no time to do it. That there were references in the 17th century that were gifted. The armors were gifted by Shah Abbas, right? So travelers that go and they're describing it. That's how they describe it. Well, my own hunch is that I wouldn't come and say it. Is that he's actually the other figure is the Ottoman, the other Oriental. So he's just staging this. Is arming. It's very simple. He's arming the Persian king against the Turks, right? In the Uffizi, right? And he's enjoying the scene. That's what I think is going on.
Appropriation of the Persian by the Medici, who, like most European leaders, political leaders, kind of demonized the Turks, the Ottomans, and used the Persians as the good example of the Medici kingship. What I would like to know is whether you have more information about how the Medici appropriated the Persian kingship in terms of political imagination. Because we all know that the Ottomans were always presented as a counter-example of or despots or tyrants, and so most political treatises in 16th and 17th century, they present the Ottomans as what a king, a Western European king should not be.
Yes.
Like a vivid example of the tyrant of a despot. Now, the Persian kingship, as you presented here, was not just appropriated by the Medici, but many of the features, or at least what the Medici thought that the kingship, the concept of kingship in Persian was, it was used and appropriated by the Medici. In what sense, or which features of the Persian notion of rulership interested most the Medici? It was just like imperial ideology or a grandiose display of power using Asian elements for the purpose of self-fashioning, or was there any more detail or focuses or specific aspect of Persian notions of rulership included in the discourse produced by the Medici?
Well, okay.
I don't know if I was clear.
No, you're very clear. You're very clear, and I'm trying to see what I can say and what I cannot say. I think the very I think the hunt. This is why the hunting is important here for me. This is why I began with. So there's kind of the court ceremonials of kind of the hunting feast is important here as becoming part of the rituals of the Medici themselves, right? So when in fact when the ambassadors arrive, just like Shah Abbas is never there when everybody arrives is hunting, in this case as well, Ferdinand is not there. Here they have to wait because he's gone hunting, right? So I think for Francesco, and this I'm just speaking from the text that I know, from my limited sense of the texts and interpreting what I see, is that he was much more interested in this kind of the mythical Persian kings as this first Qumars, as the first mythical king that gives civilization, that gives the arts. Thus his foundry, thus his studiolo, thus is creating all these various workshops in Florence to give order and workshops in the arts, right? As a kind of a civilizing enterprise, right? That's a kind of that was the model of a king, Persian king. That was what the king did, and I think that I would say it would be very different for Ferdinand. I think they're very different people, right?
The way the Persians were treated, because as you know, the Ottomans sometimes were always blamed for treating the subjects as slaves.
Yes.
So there was a kind of really vertical domination of the people. Is there any account about the way the Persians regarded and were treated by
The way the Persians were treated by the king?
by their own king?
Well, depends, because the Shah Abbas and the Safavi kings were truly romanticized, and because Shah Abbas did have a Christian wife, in fact there were these, and very importantly that I did not mention, and because he was a Shia, he just started his new sect of Islam, they actually thought he is not really Muslim, right? He's actually Christian at heart, and there was tremendous effort to send missionaries, and he allowed missionaries in to convert. So the question of conversion also becomes very important, that they thought he's going to convert Iran, Persia is going to become Christian, because, you know, he is so much like us.
Didn't the idealization of Persia continue into the 18th century, in that many French Enlightenment writers idealized Persia and set some of their stories
Montesquieu.
in Persia, or that part of the Orient, and contrasted that idealized picture with the realities in France.
And you're thinking of Montesquieu.
I think you Montesquieu in particular, yes.
Well, it's such a later, it's a different moment, and I
But you don't
I
see
d-
any continuity.
I haven't really thought about that. I don't even agree that Montesquieu is idealizing these Persians at all, right? It's not a happy place, that harem in Persia, in back home.
It was a mixed picture.
Yes, but it works really well. Persians, as others, they work really well in the 18th century to come and to comment upon the European social customs as this other civilization. But by that time, I think Persians have lost much of their glamour and their cachet, I think, in reality.
Another very anecdotal question, which is, did the Armenian turn out to actually be an ambassador or not?
Yes, well, who knows? I mean, who knows? I think Shah Abbas actually, he did this on purpose. I mean, he sent multiple agents all the time, everywhere, to cancel each other, right? Because he trusted no one. But what looks like is happening is that this Armenian trade is important for him. He's going to pursue this via the Armenian mediations, and he's going to let Robert Shirley talk to the East India companies and to the Western powers in order to take the Hormuz and the Persian Gulf away from the Portuguese. So he's playing on both sides. But the Armenian trade is very important for him, because until the middle of the 17th century, Armenians have the monopoly of silk trade in in Persia that is much more than even the East India companies. So it's tremendous. Does that make sense?
Mhm.
No?
It's the same as the Armenian merchants. Are they the same still around?
In Livorno. Well, the Livornino laws were abolished in 1861.
I can say that there's a very, very small, as an Armenian emissary myself,
Huh.
there's a very small Armenian community left in Livorno, minuscule, but it used to be quite large.
Mhm.
It's an incredibly storied city
Mhm.
in the Middle East past.
Mhm.
It's rather depressing now how little of that is left. There's an art historian at Stanford who does some work on patronage and Armenian.
What's this?
And I will remember it now.
Great, thank you.
Conference on Armenian networks in Portugal where we had the Telescope Foundation, which is very
Okay.
recent. The youth
Just data
I wanted to ask if there's any connection between the three Magi, powers of divination, and the story of the three sons who fight camel fights, vaccines, and
the three sons that they.
I think that Carlo Ginzburg talks about,
Mhm.
which is the story that I think was published in the 15 epistles, which
Mhm.
Ferdinand was born and he was expelled by their father, the king, and sent off into the world,
Mhm.
about the world, and they accused of stealing a camel because they identified the camel by its tracks and so
Mhm.
comes of that I've lost a camel. So yeah, the camel was linked to the Japanese treaty. It was being ridden by a pregnant woman, and it had milk on one, butter on one side and honey on the other. And they said, well, the guy who owns the camel says, you can only know that he keeps stealing my camel, so they're throwing him in jail. And then they tell the three brothers, say how they managed to do this. They found the camel's tracks, they found heavy on one side, they went in with some grass on one side, so like a grind in one eye, and the boy goes. It seems to me a fantasy, a sort of story about the powers of these Persian men to have, not quite divination. I mean, people say this is the origins of the detective knowledge. They use traces of tools to reconstruct a missing event. And it just seems to me such an interesting link. The three sons are like the three Magi, their power is that they go to a court and they are able to reveal something, some information. I just wondered if there's a kind of myth of the Persian ability to do that runs quite a long way through history.
But the Magi story, according to Trexler, and I'm convinced actually that it's the single most important story of the New Testament. That is, it's the key, right? That is, there is no Jesus until, right, he is recognized by this. It's very powerful actually, right? That his birth is nothing until it's recognized by these three foreigners, these exotic others, right? So the recognition of the exotic others becomes really important component. Now, who these three people are continuously changes throughout, right? This for 1,000 years continually changes, and why there are three? Because there are three continents, so they represent different continents, and then they cease to be important after the discovery of the New World, so they don't represent the world anymore. So I can only speak about it historically, as Trexler does, rather than why. I mean, structurally, I wouldn't know why that is so important. Right? Structurally, I don't know how to make sense of these three, but only historically, and I can speak about it. And I think what is interesting is that how they become the three Cavalieri, the three horsemen, right, in the wedding, right, and they are coming from Persia. They're having heard about this wedding. They come to pay tribute, and that's for me is interesting. It's very similar grammar. Right? Yeah. Yes, please. I have the name. I can tell you later. I actually have it here. But, yes.
I had a couple of questions. One about the three Persian
Yes.
Cavalieri. I mean, it sounds incredibly like material from romance. I mean, this whole thing is
Yeah.
turning up, and we're going to defend
Yes.
the honour
Yes.
or the beauty of
Medieval
the
romance. Yeah.
well, or contemporary romance. I was just wondering whether you've looked into the romance tradition for the representation of Persians and Persian knights within. I mean, it's a pretty daunting task because
I
there's
have not.
thousands of these romances of chivalry going on right, you know, into the 17th century. My impression is they get more and more exotic as they go along. But even though they're completely fantastic, they are also kind of picking up on geopolitics at the time. And I'd be really intrigued to see whether there were traces of those Persian knights.
Yeah, I don't, I haven't looked for one thing, Adam, but it's a very, one should look to see what is going on, where Francesco is picking up it's odd. No? I don't think I've not come across anything like this, the Persian horseman. Right? It's not something that I recognized anywhere, but it's worth looking.
It's juxtaposed with the three Magi coming to recognise
Yes.
Christ as you did there, even though it's incredibly potent with the Medician background. It seems almost sacrilegious, doesn't it? They're coming here to recognise the marriage of Francesco de' Medici. But that's what made me start wondering whether there were other literary contexts.
Well, he was provocative, Francesco. Huh? He was. I mean, nobody liked this wedding with Bianca, and so I mean, people might have even. He was radical. He might be sacrilegious, but the whole wedding was sacrilegious in some ways. So, but I will look into that.
My other question is about this extraordinary kind of montage with the shield. I think the notion that it's kind of reflecting the tradition of palace as well. It's very. I mean, even though it's clearly of Shah Abbas, it could be kind of fusing the two traditions, because that has a close association with the Medici in the 13th century as well. But what I was wondering is, if this was up for any length of time in such a kind of gossipy and well-reported court, are there not accounts of it or
accounts of this
other than inventories and so on? Are there not sort of descriptions?
There's one article on this, and only one article that I've read of the Ulrich Middledorf that I said. It's a 1966 article.
But does he quote, diaries and chronicles and so on?
Yes, he does. Yes, he does.
And
extensively.
How are people interpreting it?
They're saying that they're interpreting this as gifts by Shah Abbas. I can actually I have a few of them, I think, here that I just didn't read them. By, for example, no, I don't. I took it out because it's too long.
But they don't explain the narrative scenario. So here's this knight representing this, and this knight. Presumably you would have.
No, they don't. Yes, they don't. But I haven't gone to the original documents, right? I'm just going by the article, which is extensive. Itself. So he quotes these sources, the 17th century sources. I have not looked at them. They're German sources and they're English sources. Right? The Germans they're mostly visitors who go and look at. So the way they are described is that it was very compelling. It was actually scary because there was this Oriental Shah Abbas figure. But they specifically say that these were gifts by Shah Abbas, or that in some cases they were saying it was a stand-in for Shah Abbas. So it's called the Scudo di Shah Abbas in the inventory. It's interesting.
It's amazing.
It's interesting. Yes, that there is such things that imagine when I saw the reference to it, that I was very intrigued by that. Yes. Yeah, as a continuation, well, it's a very different moment than from the 15th century. And also the visits to the Egyptian sultans changed before Constantinople fall and after the fall of Constantinople. But it's very different. I feel that, I mean, I actually worked a little bit on this one ambassador that is Brancacci's extensively visit to Egypt. It's a very different encounter, right? With Egyptians than it is with the Persians, actually. There is it's a different geopolitics specifically at this moment, because Persia is going to be the true ally and friend and equal, right, of these Western powers from each side of this Ottoman land. What they talk about in their letters back and forth, what they talk about are a few things constantly. First, they repeat the same stuff. I mean, that we really like each other. They express our friendship, and we are allies. And they address freedom of trade for minorities in Persia. That's very important. So Shah Abbas is granting that they can trade. Freedom of religion. So they can practice their religion, and he allows missionaries, friars, specifically Franciscan friars, to be in Isfahan, and their archives is actually the most extensive of for this period. So this is what they're speaking about, as well as then the military agreements, and these are the 3-4 issues that they constantly talk about.
And there's no mention of Persia whatsoever, and I was wondering how well publicized this was outside of the wedding celebrations and
Where was this?
All over Italy, actually.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
the Tuscan women as well.
That they repeat your question again. I didn't get the logic.
I was just curious how widely known this sort of Persian possibility was of this Eastern ally in terms of people who were writing texts sort of to the Medici and other people who talk about this sort of idea of fighting against the Turks, but it was not one of the Christian
Mm-hmm.
community.
I would be very surprised if Scipione Admirato did not know. I would be very surprised, right? Because he was interested in these genealogies, of creating these dynastic genealogies of European powers and the Medicis, and I actually think he was consulting the kind of genealogy that I showed you, right, of the Persian kings. So, and he's very much within it's his time. It's his duke. I would be very surprised if he didn't know, that he was not aware of. Now, how serious they were about a crusade that's really the question. I don't think they were very serious about it. And I think little by little Shah Abbas is getting the point that they're not really serious. It's just a talk. I think the figure of Piero della Valle is very interesting. He leaves Europe, and he actually says this again. It's rhetorical. He says, "I'm leaving. I'm going to go to the king who's actually serious about this crusade against the Turks." Right. So he goes to Persia and stays there and lives with the court of Shah Abbas for 7 years toward the crusade from the other side. Right. It's really interesting.
Well, if there are no more questions, should we just say thanks once more?
Thank you
That
for
was
having me.
fascinating.
Thank you very much. Thanks.